Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this final episode in this series of Activist Lawyer. Today, we are joined by Dr. Yassin Brunger, who is a lecturer in human rights law and the co-director of the Gender, Justice and Society Research Network at Queen's University, Belfast. We hope you enjoy today's recording. We look forward to you joining us again for the next series. We already have some fantastic guests lined up. And again, follow us on all social media. And thank you once again for joining us. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Yassin Brunger. Hello, Dr. Yassin Brunger.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. We've been in contact for a little while, haven't we, around this?
Thank you for the invitation.
Not at all. We were really excited, but I can't believe time has gone by so fast since we were first in contact. So we were very excited to have you down here, and thank you for joining us in person. We're also very happy to have that. But so I read through a little outline of your work and your experience, but I'm hoping you can take our listeners just maybe through your own journey and just share with us your experience. So that's our first question to you.
Okay. So I am a Gambian who has been living sort of in different parts of the UK and Northern Ireland for, 20-something years. Time flies. Gambia, for your listeners, is a beautiful country, smallest country in continental Africa. It's on the west coast of Africa. It's got a population around 2 million or so. And I say those figures not to be David Attenborough and give you National Geographic, but to say that I come from a space that's similar to Northern Ireland. Everybody knows everybody. There's a kind of closeness within the community, or communities, I should say. But I've been happily living in Northern Ireland sort of on and off for, 13 odd years. So I did my PhD at Queen's, which brought me to Belfast. Didn't know anything about it. People were very freaked out just because Northern Ireland had that reputation, as I'm sure everyone knows. But I was excited to come. I was like, look, let's just do this. I had been brought up in the Middle East. And then, so I was used to kind of being almost nomadic in my travels and adventurous. So going to new places was not a problem. So when I landed in Belfast, I was so intrigued, number one.
Intrigued.
Just because it was so clear that I was a visible minority in a city. And I think I'm going to say I was a visible minority woman. Which makes a huge difference and dynamic, and so that's been interesting, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about a number of issues related to that. But I came back to Queen's as a lecturer in 2016, and I would describe myself as a feminist international lawyer. That's kind of my training. That's my ethos. That's my bread and butter. That's what I kind of get up and figure out how to do little bits of contributing to changing the world. But I start off by saying feminist because I think that is fundamentally who I am personally, politically, professionally. And I'm sure we'll unpack what that means for your listeners. So I teach in the areas of human rights, transitional justice, gender in the law, criminal justice. So that's a little bit about me.
A little bit. Wow. So let's just unpack the feminist international lawyer piece. What does that mean to you?
Oh, gosh, so much. I think, first of all, it means being multi-dimensional in how I understand patriarchal violence. So, we're going straight in there with the P's.
Let's go.
Patriarchy in all its forms and oppressions. But ultimately, I think I can't look at things sort of in binary or linear ways, right? Because there's so many histories in the way that we understand violence that has to inform our practice and our responses to it, right? And patriarchy manifests itself in multiple forms, right? And then, as I explain to my students, we should understand patriarchy in the way that we understand capitalism, right? It is a system, right? It is a system that shapes our understanding around these kind of gendered oppressions. And so it's important to to think about how our activism, how our lawyering responds to and challenges that and dismantles it as a system. So my feminism is informed by Black African feminists. And so I always say to my students, like, Black in the sense that we have, you know, Black feminists, whether it's your Angela Davis, whether it's Bell Hooks, whether it's the Combahee River Collective, you know, whether it's Black British feminists, like, that sense of what is a Black feminist is transnational in understanding, right? You could go to seeing how Black feminists move in Brazil and fight police violence and learn lessons about that in terms of our responses to police violence nationally, locally. So I think for me also being an African, and I was very much brought up like, yes, I'm a Gambian, but in a household where I was reminded of a broader continental identity, which I thought was interesting when Brexit came about and there was that whole departure from being like part of Europe and the kind of European project. I was very much brought up with a kind of Pan-African household. So our stories about human rights, about justice, about inequality is informed from, you know, Namibia to South Africa to Senegal to Egypt to Algeria, right? And so again, for me as a lawyer, that feminism to me is so expansive. It's where I feel most comfortable to then bring it back to the work that I do locally, right? Mm-hmm. And I think whenever I kind of talk to people about it, they're like, oh my God, like they're so overwhelmed by like all these feminisms. But I think it helps because then you can see opportunities that you may not have seen. You can see limitations. You can see where there's work to be done. You can see voices that are excluded, right? And I think particularly in Northern Ireland where there is a strong kind of women's movement and a feminist ethos, I think there is still so much work to be done about thinking about a feminist movement here that is, you know, intersectional, that is thinking about the ways in which we challenge the kind of racial dynamics of gendered violence, how minoritized communities are left behind. So while we move forward with, you know, domestic violence, sexual violence, different aspects of the kind of feminist agenda, every conversation I've had or spaces I've been in where we've had really difficult but important discussions, people acknowledge that they have left behind many communities. And so for me, my feminism informs that, right? It's not to say like finger wagging, you're not doing the right thing, but it's to say like, what do we need to do better? What are we doing if we're really looking for feminist liberation? Like, what does that mean if we're leaving behind travelers? If we're not thinking about domestic abuse and how it affects Somali refugees who are in Northern Ireland, or how it affects communities from a Muslim background. I grew up in a Muslim household. And so, like, these things matter. Right?
And they're often missing, which is the thing.
Missing.
And it's great to have that movement. And I've, you know, been part of that in both the Republic of Ireland and here, just in a very kind of loose sense from the margins, but just interested in watching it evolve compared to maybe the situation 10 years ago when it wasn't really there, apart from some major, you know, forerunners and speakers that we all know now and we identify with them. But that intersectionality piece isn't there even to this day. And I think... So one of my next questions was how your experience and your thoughts and how you see yourself can translate to your work here. And we'll maybe go into that a little bit further. But just to say, I came across yourself and other fantastic speakers, I have to say, in an event that complemented the Choose to Challenge theme, which was International Women's Day 2 years ago, I think we were saying, during the pandemic. And it was on Zoom, of course. Unfortunately, everything was back then. But I just took so much away from that. It really inspired me. And I just sat quietly listening to women speak about the barriers that they face, not only as women, but women from within communities that we don't really have their experiences shared. We don't see even data published or have people. So it was fantastic to have this forum. And it was the Northwest Migrants Forum had organised it. And it was just so empowering just to sit and listen.
Yep.
And one of the when people asked, I think people were, typing in questions into the panel, and it was, well, how do we help? How can women and society, not just women, but how do we become allies? And how do we support your work and your message? What do we do? Is there still room for that conversation? What can we do to make sure that remains on the table and progresses and evolves as part of the feminist struggle, I guess, in this part of the world?
I think that's a really great question because, the kind of concept of allyship is a big one, I think, particularly when we think about our recent history with, Sarah Everard, when we think about George Floyd, our understanding of the necessity of allyship in our everyday activities has become, much more like in our consciousness.
Sure.
But I think the risk is that we perform allyship without necessarily embedding it in actually our daily practice. And I say practice with a kind of XIS, right? which is how you actually do your daily work, whether you're an immigration lawyer, whether you're a criminal barrister. How do these things touch your work? And there is always space and possibility, which is part of where the kind of feminist imaginations that inform my work and inspire me. So yes, I think it's important to have those conversations and think about ways of allyship, but also solidarity. I think I've learned in Northern Ireland that so many examples of actions of solidarity go a long way. But then it's how to translate, say, a protest in a street about George Floyd dying into an understanding about, racism and how that affects domestic violence, racism and how that affects sexual violence, racism and how that affects, the reporting of rape incidents. Because it does, right? It does. It may be invisible to many in Northern Ireland, but it does. And so within kind of the communities that I'm part of, the African and Caribbean community in Northern Ireland, it's important to think about ways to engage not only us, but the diverse communities in Northern Ireland. As we talked about earlier before the recording, traveller communities who have been here for a very long time. And so I think our necessity to maybe start worrying about, am I a good ally, into thinking about, right, so great, we're moving forward with, domestic violence in this manner. This is great. But have we done enough to engage minority communities? What have we done? Actually, not even done enough. Have we done anything?
Yeah.
Let's ask that question.
Absolutely.
And I think, it's some of those starting questions that are difficult, especially when you've been when you've been working on an issue and you're in it and you're it's been hard, right? It's been really hard to get equal marriage.
Yeah.
But what does that mean when it translates to communities? If you're a gay person from Afghanistan, as we talked about, right? Do you see organizations in Northern Ireland as a space for you? We still have barriers.
We do.
Let's
There's
be
a
real.
Huge piece missing of that.
Right?
In all sectors. I mean, you just mentioned there violence against women. That's a huge glaring one.
Massive.
I think that we need a huge amount of work done, both north and south. And we've had people on to speak about that before. But it's keeping it on the table. And as you say, there's no point being an ally. Allyship is fantastic, and we definitely see in terms of sharing work, sharing publications, awareness raising. But as you said, it needs to be embedded into our communities, and without that, it's not helping at all. Evolve the situation for people who potentially are victims or survivors of, let's say, just domestic violence, as one example. But there are many. But
So we obviously done plenty of research before you came on here, and your work has been extensive in terms of your research paper, your work, many communities and groups that you're part of. How has your work and your research sought to challenge or highlight racial inequality, specifically within Northern Ireland?
Oh gosh, that's such a big one.
A big
one. Really important.
It's an open question. Question.
Believe it or not, sometimes that starting point of even getting people to acknowledge that there is an issue around kind of, or racial dynamics attached to the gender dynamics. And this is where, you know, intersectionality is encompasses more than just race, but it is rooted in a Black feminist history. And even just getting people to understand that and make that connection, honestly, is a big step. Because organizations know themselves. They know how they work. Individuals, whether you're, like I say, a lawyer, a barrister, a judge, you know, or a police officer in Women's Aid, you have been working in your space. You know, you're experienced. But then someone comes along and has a conversation with you, or you read a paper or a report or a workshop, a lot of workshops, where you then hear somebody mention like, oh, you know, I was, you know, working with, or somebody who spoke to me from the Black community where I share stories about, who was a victim of violence, didn't feel comfortable going to the PSNI, so relied on community support, right? So one is trying to advocate and say, well, go to Nexus or Women's Aid, but people don't feel comfortable. People don't feel safe.
Sure.
Which is hard to hear when you're the service provider, or you're the police, or you're the Ministry of Justice, because you want to reach out to these communities, but you feel like, oh, but how do I do that? And some of it is getting people around the table, going to people, right? I remember having a conversation with one organization based in the North Coast where I was like, you decide definitions. So you're sitting in your room saying, do we use ethnic minority? Do we say Black? What do we do? I was like, go into the communities that you're working with and ask them, connect with them. Like, if you're going to center minority voices, racialized voices, let's do that. Because we do that on one hand where we talk about survivors and victims. So why can't we do that when it comes to understanding some of these more, you know, layered identities, right? And so I think for me, my work, particularly here, is often about starting that for people, igniting that within them to say, right, okay, what could my organization do? I hate the idea of offering this kind of bulletin solution, like, here you go, here's the package, you can become more racial equal. I think that is not sustainable. It has to be rooted in some kind of understanding, some kind of organic, holistic appreciation of the work and the experience that you've been doing, but also connecting to the communities that you seek to include, that you seek to represent. One of the things, certainly in the Northwest Migrants Forum, is about, you know, the politics and how we want to encourage minorities who have been here for a long time to use their political power, to stand for local elections, etc. But even if we don't, and I include myself in it, we should hold our leaders accountable, right? So people who have been canvassing within my neighborhood, first question they get after the knock is about racial equality. If they haven't read the racial equality strategy, at least as a bare thing, and give me some spiel about being inclusive and how they want to do that, like, that tells me that you don't really care about my vote, right? So my work is trying, particularly here, to at least ignite that conversation going forward and think about pathways to kind of liberating us from racial inequality as well as gendered violence, right? Because the patriarchy comes in all forms and it hurts all genders.
All genders, yeah. And I mean, we can even see there with, you know, for example, the public inquiries that they're holding now.
Absolutely.
There's really a movement there to bring the survivors' experience as the centre narrative to get things, and I think that's something we've seen over the past 5-6 years, whereas it wasn't part of the discussion before. I'm thinking maybe just about mother and baby homes, but there's so many other inquiries or investigations that go on that people are now starting to say, no, we want to start from, you know, the victim or the survivor's story first, and you can see that movement. But I guess what you're saying, and I see it at so many different kind of organisations or committees that I sit on, it's almost like a tick box exercise to say the right word. And as long as you're including that word, haven't you done enough? But I think it's a great example that you use there about women getting into politics and, you know, to try and encourage that more. But really for us to understand the racial, the strategy at least, that we don't really, I haven't seen it discussed at all.
It doesn't include anything around gender violence.
I've never, you know, when you're just looking at now coming up to the elections, it's 5th of May, isn't it here?
5th of May, yeah.
It's not, I mean, it's not discussed at all. But I think you do see equality as a word plastered pretty much everywhere.
Yep.
So it's, what does that mean, as you say, in reality, on the ground within our communities? And I hope, you know, I think this is quite an inspiring discussion for people listening today, just to really think about that when they do vote. And that's a valid question to ask somebody. So who knocks on your door? I'll not tell you what I asked. But anyway, so
totally. And I think one thing I would add to that is the way that it affects people's lives in multiple ways. So one of the projects I'm currently working on is thinking about how we understand like the experience of racism across someone's everyday life. Okay, so particularly we're focusing on women, but so you could capture their experiences in race, hate, crime, sure, in domestic violence or sexual violence if they're affected, but also, what about the healthcare system? When they're asked to prove their immigration status as a pregnant woman going in to get healthcare, and you're there in a room full of predominantly white other expected mothers, and you are then the one who is spotlighted to prove their status. They don't quietly pull you aside. They do this in front of everybody else. So they other you actively. Right?
Straight away.
There's a human rights issue right there.
Thank you so much for raising that. That's something that we deal with all the time. There
you go.
And they're handed the questionnaire in
right
front. This is your
front of everybody.
People are absolutely startled. We get the phone call. Hi, Sarah. We've got a questionnaire here that we've been asked. The panic for a pregnant woman, maybe 7-8 months at this stage, whatever, to fill out this questionnaire. Do we have to pay? What are we going to be charged this? We don't have any money. So this is what they're thinking of, instead of, I'm going in for my scan now. I'm going, to be in a relaxed environment. Yeah. They're immediately kind of set aside from everybody else. So we're dealing with this today, funny enough, within our work today. We have to deal with this with the BSO. But you're so right, and I'm glad you brought that up.
It's a human rights issue.
And we actually seen it just before COVID hit. We were at a discussion over in the Arts Centre, and they were discussing the travel between mainland UK and Northern Ireland, and how they would have random checks, immigration, and actually the percentage of black and minority groups that were stopped. They would never stop a white person travelling between the UK and Northern Ireland. And it's one of those things that it happens, but unless somebody calls it out, it's never really discussed. It's just, that's the way it is.
And I think coming up to election time, it's starting to come on the table now for certain people who will raise it as an issue now coming up. But it's been quiet for so long. Thankfully, groups are getting together. I know along Derry, Donegal border, there was a really great protest. But I think we need one here too, in Uri, between Uri and Louth. But a huge problem that people just don't really, maybe they don't know it's happening, but it's happening, and I've witnessed it, not just in practice as an immigration solicitor. When our clients tell us this, I've seen it on the bus myself several times. So a huge piece of work to be done there. Just number one, to highlight it as an issue. Yeah. But and education, you were going to say as well.
Right, same kind of spaces. So a lot of stories, again, because people would come to me knowing that I'm outspoken about this, but B, that I'm going to find out what we can do and who we write angry letters to, who we have a phone call with, who do we have a meeting with. So a kind of activism that goes beyond writing my papers and my books, but one that where if someone calls me or emails me or says, this has happened, right, who do I need to tweet to get this, to get some attention to this? Because, education is one that comes up all the time. Parents who come and we're talking about just, how their kids are doing, and children who persistently from a young age, from like P2, P3, are navigating and having to learn the ways in which like they are made to feel other. Right? So even if it's just the pronunciation of your name, it's like, okay, well, I don't know, we'll just call you Yaz because we can't say Yassin. Well, no, my name's Yassin. And you're the only one in the class because the teacher can't be bothered to say your like ethnic name.
You notice that actually here, that people actually change their names and pick different names just to
Right?
suit.
These are
other people.
microaggressions.
Yeah.
These are what we call microaggressions. Racism isn't just about calling people horrific names, but these microaggressions, right? Whether it's in the hospital, whether it's at the airport, whether it's in, you know, a little kid whose name is being butchered because the teacher can't be bothered. So they don't want to feel like othered. But these are human rights issues. If we go back to human rights and social justice and think about what we want our children to feel within the education system, right? Let's think about that from primary right to tertiary level education, right? The attainment gap, the way that teachers will potentially marginalize, the stories that we tell and the stereotypes perpetuated within schools. So there's a wonderful woman in Axoni, Nandi, who works on education curriculum, right, in Northern Ireland, and thinking about what is the curriculum teaching children about minorities, right, and the stereotypes perpetuated within them. So that's what I mean about thinking about racial dynamics, gender dynamics, combining those two in every space.
Yeah. And have young people as well share their experiences. I remember being at an event in Dublin quite a few years back that you spoke there about, from primary level up right through to secondary to third level, this microaggression that you've referred to there, that continues and really impacts young people applying for jobs.
Yes.
Young people who were born in Ireland. And they said, things that just really struck me, that they didn't want to use their own names. They wanted to change it simply for the purposes of applying for a job.
Yeah.
They also were worried in some jobs where they asked you, or applications, you had to upload a photograph. This concerned a young, educated Irish person.
Yes.
Simply because of the colour of their skin. This was in their mind. So, I mean, those conversations from young people, their experiences have to affect change. And that was that was maybe about 5 years ago or so that I saw that. So, I mean, hopefully matters are evolving in that. But as you said, we still have many, many hurdles to overcome there.
Many
to
hurdles.
Stop this from such a young age.
Many.
Education, health, every aspect of our lives, really.
And there's one area or event, we'll call it, which is the pandemic.
Yeah.
And it showed a lot of shortfalls within
That's
our
right.
society, within healthcare and other departments. But how did the pandemic shine a light on the systemic and racial inequality within our society?
Oh gosh, I think hugely. It just exacerbated what was pre-existing, right? Again, in the sense that when you go out and you talk to communities who are minoritized, certainly within Northern Ireland as well as the UK, you know, you see issues around, you know, access to social services, delays in healthcare. Again, housing issues was another massive one that people came and spoke to me about. And I think the pandemic just demonstrated, you know, when it came to the rise in domestic abuse, that also would affect ethnic minority communities. But when you look at, certainly here, the kind of stories around it, that experience is not captured, right? It's not to say it's not important to get a sense of the story being told at the moment. But again, if we can't recognize domestic abuse and the rise of that within the context of minoritized communities, then we're missing out and we're further marginalizing people who are already being marginalized by the system. So I think there's just so much that the pandemic kind of exposed, and then the gaps that it just exacerbated. My concern has always been that becomes normalized, right? So the gaps continue, and we live with it. So our quote unquote new normal is not to rectify it, but it is to continue to kind of just keep calm, carry on.
Put it behind us.
And
Right?
the wider the gap, the more normal it becomes.
And the gap will then widen, right? On top of it, what I'm sure you both know, austerity measures. immigration rules that went just further.
It's getting worse.
Getting worse, right?
And it becomes so bad, people think that it's so bad it can't be fixed. And
Yep.
they'll just rather leave it
Yep.
than try and fight.
Women in the workplace,
Yeah.
right? We
Yeah.
talked about the economic consequences of COVID on women.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's highlighted issues that were already there, 100%.
Yep.
But it's also given authorities and the government an opportunity to abuse vulnerable people as well, and women when they continue, to make policy, using
Absolutely.
COVID and the pandemic as an excuse
Yeah.
almost. So I think we see that happening a lot now. But
And then a lack of recognition of really like some of the contributions that minoritized people make. So let me give you one example that is a live issue. So I'm working with a group of women who work in the health and social care system. So they worked in a lot of the nursing homes and provide, they're mostly care workers, okay? And a lot of them are from different parts of Africa. So here working, and they worked throughout the pandemic, right? Throughout the pandemic, we saw minorities go out and put themselves on the front lines day after day, not even just in care, but also in our hospitals. But I'll talk about the care system. The amount of racism these women have faced is extraordinary. So when they were talking about this to me, I was like, right, do you know what we need to do? Everybody needs to start to write down, just keep account of everything that happens, right? So just keep a diary, write what happened, write who you spoke to. So to start to document this, right? And pass it on, tell it to the other women, right? And they're like, oh, but what are we going to do? I was like, let's just create a dossier and then we'll find a lawyer. Because ultimately, the trust involved, right, need to know about this. And rather than present them this evidence where they might just dismiss all of your experiences as anecdotal, because that often happens with organizations. Oh, it's one-off or it's, right? If we document it to demonstrate it systematically, we find a lawyer who will connect this with the human rights issues that it is clearly bringing up, then this is where we can start to advocate for change. Some of the women were just like, we'll just move jobs.
Yeah. They don't feel supported at all. And you know what? They're in a vulnerable, most of them are feeling vulnerable anyway because they're subject to a hostile, vile immigration system that they're worried to speak up about. How awful is that to live? And that's no life to live.
Yeah.
That you cannot, address systematic abuse and racism within your daily job where you are. And we've clients as well here who worked, 2 jobs through the whole pandemic.
That's right.
And not a word of, thanks is nothing. I mean, you can stand and clap for people all you want and do these token gestures, but it just makes my blood boil that we know them as well, Jack, in such vulnerable positions. They're afraid to speak out and afraid that it might affect their job or with some. Always living in that, and they've been here 20 years. They've got children born. It just really is getting to the point now where something.
So you've
has
got
to be
class,
done.
you've got race, you've got an immigration system. So all of that will perpetuate a particular kind of oppression that they have to live with day in, day out, that renders them silent when they face racial abuse in the workplace. So it creates this culture, this toxic culture, which makes minorities feel just silent, just keep quiet about it. I'll just move jobs or I won't say anything because I depend on that livelihood. These are working class women. So we can see the importance of understanding that. But when you talk to politicians, they'll say, oh, we're working on race hate crime. That's something great. But I'm telling you about a particular story going on in the healthcare system. What are you doing about that? Race hate crime, criminalizing race hate is one thing, but actually there is an employment issue going on here, tagged along with racial inequality.
Yeah, absolutely. My goodness.
Yeah, and you find that within society, sometimes the government and the powers from above kind of push people down and people have to worry about the paychecks and they have to worry about where the food's coming out and they can't afford to really question inequalities because they're they're thinking about the basic needs for their
all
family.
leads into poverty.
Yeah.
It's all intersectional as well, and that, you know,
which is where my feminism
Yeah.
comes from, right? Seeing things
full
multidimensionally
circle.
like that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and so as I know, you're an academic within Queen's, and third level education has experienced wide scale strikes at the moment. When I was studying in Queen's last year, the last 2 years, there was a few strikes when I was there. So you've been very open about how both university staff and students deserve better and have the right to strike, to fight for better. So how exhausting but important is industrial action in transforming the current university structure and environment?
For me, I see it as a human rights issue. And I have said this within our kind of union where we've had webinars or talks, or, you know, this isn't just an employment issue. If we think about it from a human rights perspective, right? Your working conditions, labor exploitation tag teams along with our fight for social justice and human rights. And so for me, it is imperative that universities respond to that, because again, we see the gendered consequences to that, we see the racialized consequences to that, whether it's pay inequality, whether it's the exploitive working conditions, particularly of early career staff who are on precarious contracts for a lot of them, but not even necessarily early career. You have lots of staff who are on who have been on these temporary short-term contracts that give them very little job security. Try and arrange that when you're trying to do childcare or where you have a healthcare emergency. Like, it's really problematic. And I think for the amount of money that universities and certainly Queen's has and makes and has in reserves, it is shocking, some of the stories that you hear from the picket line and from many of us who participate in the strikes. One very powerful example that I give is with the issue around the childcare workers, right? So who worked throughout the pandemic and then had their working conditions changed by the employer, right? Not to the benefit of them, but to the benefit of the employer and the detriment of them. So they protested, right? Queen's creche workers.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, you can't have an institution who doesn't see, on the one hand, the necessity to support its creche workers by giving them strong working conditions, but at the same time hails its gender credentials. Yep. Right? It's hypocrisy. And I think people are tired of that hypocrisy, right? That you see academics coming in and out of the classroom, giving time to their students, doing the best that they can, but who feel insecure, whose pensions have been cut extraordinarily, right? So we see this, and we've had enough, right? And it's been an ongoing dispute, but I think the palpable anger and exhaustion is so clear now. And it's time for politicians in Northern Ireland to back workers at the university, to back the union and its campaign. We saw so many strikes going on in Belfast very recently with a number of different unions. You know, we are in a time of crisis when it comes to exploitation economically by those who, my goodness, should know better.
Yeah, it feels like a
So
total contradiction of the purpose and the, what would you call it, the feeling of Queen's is diversity,
the ethos.
Inclusivity. And it completely contradicts that.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it's hard for people to continue to live with that and just kind of keep silent.
So drastic action. Well, that continues, doesn't it? And that's ongoing at the moment. But just back, we touched on this a little bit, but we have to highlight some change. And I know by the time this airs, we're probably in a different scenario when it comes to immigration. But the reason I'm bringing this up is it's just very topical, obviously with our work, but you've been outspoken as well on issues around deportation, these kind of deportations from Northern Ireland, even over to Scotland, without notice, that nobody would really be familiar that this is actually happening here. There's that, but there's so much to contend with. And I think the media, to a certain extent, or certain corners of the media, covers some of it, but there's really so much goes on unnoticed, only for those who are working within it or those who are subject to the absolutely degrading treatment that they receive. But heavy-handed, you know, treatment against vulnerable people living here. But it's so disheartening to see that every week that goes by, it almost seems to get worse. You know, another policy with the anti-refugee bill, otherwise known as the Nationality and Borders Bill.
Yep.
We've the hostile environment that we just mentioned. You know, we still are dealing with the aftermath of Windrush and the disaster that created.
Absolutely.
Horrendous decisions that are ongoing every day and subject to challenge. And now we've got Rwanda and a partnership.
Yep.
A partnership with the UK and Rwanda to offshore, which we know that's not really what they're doing.
Yep.
Vulnerable men, women and children, because that's what it will be, to Rwanda,
Yep.
of all places.
Yep.
What do you think about this? And I mean, how do you, even from a legal perspective, do we expect challenges under the convention? I mean, it has to be a fundamental breach of human rights to send one there. How do you see this evolving, or will it get to that stage, or is this just tokenistic, you know, coming up to an election? Is this something that, you know, they want the message that we're Brexit
Strong
Britain,
hand, yep.
this is our protecting our borders? How do you see it playing out?
I think, I mean, the call to action is ever loud and clear. Ever loud and clear. We need to be fighting this on multiple fronts, right? So judicial review, when I tweeted about that dispersal, as I was informed that it wasn't a deportation, it was a dispersal. And I was like, okay, we're again treating human beings like in such inhumane ways. But again, without notice, you know, ripping people out of the community.
Yeah. So just to be clear to listeners, sorry, asylum seekers.
Asylum
weren't there 50
seekers,
asylum
yep,
seekers
yep.
removed from Northern Ireland
Yes.
to Scotland
Yep.
without notice. And I know that's being challenged
Yep,
at the moment, I
exactly.
think. But yeah, so
Yeah.
sorry.
So I think judicial review has to be one avenue that we use. And again, I think that's just the lawyer in me coming out. I think we have to think about a human rights litigation around this, right? The necessity of that is so important. Again, it's one of the things that I was sort of plotting with a friend of mine when she saw the tweet, and she was like, we need to get people together. We need to mobilize and think about ways. And I was like, loads of immigration lawyers got in touch with me. Let's get everybody in a room. Let's do this. Let's figure out ways to challenge this, right? Because you're right, the government, the state is going, you know, full throttle moving forward, and the kind of UK Rwanda partnership is just another example of that. And it does so because it thinks it can be unchecked.
Yeah.
And so for those of us who believe in human rights, who advocate for human rights, the call to action is there. We need to mobilize and get active in response to this. So protests is one way. I know there was one in Scotland some time ago where people protested the removal of asylum seekers.
That's right.
There's just people just surrounded the bus.
They did.
Let's do this.
Yeah. And it was so effective, wasn't it? Even
So
to get
effective.
that attention.
And
there.
again, it sends the message, right? It sends the message to the powers that be that you may continue to do this, but we see you.
Yeah.
We see what you're doing, and we will fight against it, right? That's powerful. I would have loved for people, and I saw people around when my friend called me and told me that, like, the bus is here for it, because these were a group of asylum seekers that we knew, we were friends with, and they were like, the bus is here, and she was so upset about it. And I was like, if we had done Glasgow, if we had just known and mobilized around that bus, right? At least they would know that we're not just going to go quietly. We're going to fight for people. And I think that's what I would say. Like, the state is going to continue to do what it's doing.
Yeah.
And it is scary and as hostile and degrading as you can imagine.
Yeah.
But this is where academics, activists, community workers, all of us need to be in touch and build our force field, and then go out and like fight this. Because I think if you think just going to the ballot box and voting for, which is important, is going to is going to make the change. We've seen politicians can easily put aside and deprioritize these issues that affect so many in our community.
I feel like within the government, the checks and balances that were there have been nearly removed over the last couple of years.
And Brexit has supported that
entirely.
almost.
So they can't hold themselves accountable. So I think it's now down to the people when you vote for people in, but I still think within the government the checks and balances are gone, so I think it's down to individuals to come together to really challenge it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think we've moved on from the conversation as to whether the immigration regime is inherently racist or not. It is.
It is.
But
that's not up for debate.
It's not up for debate. It is. But also the fact that it's so clear now as well, people aren't stupid, you know, that immigrants and the migrant community here are scapegoats for whenever anything goes wrong in any respect, in any aspect of community. Yeah. This is where they go back. And how unfair and how degrading is it to mess with people's lives like that just to cover up your own shortfalls? And we're seeing it time and time again. And thankfully, people are, I think, becoming live to this now.
I agree with
that. And hopefully they vote accordingly. But that's not enough, as you say. I think it's mobilising, getting together, and protest is the way forward. But I'm glad to see that some of these things are on the table now and they are becoming more visible to the general public, which is a good move. So just to kind of keep the pressure on that.
Exactly.
And I think it's kind of almost laughable that they refer to their own policy as the hostile environment. I mean, that's the language they created themselves. So fair play to them around that.
And it's that brazenness about it that should remind us all about like what it is that we're fighting against, right? In the context of, I can't remember who it was, who quoted this. I think it was Nawal El-Zadawi, who's an Egyptian feminist.
Yes.
And she talks about like patriarchy and how it manifests itself in different forms. And I always say that to my students. And it's the same when we think about immigration policy and the maneuvers of the state. Like, be aware that it will be manifest in different forms. Within Queen's, our international students are monitored in ways where if they miss one monitoring report, you know, immediately they're sent to this sort of email like, did you go to class or have you met your supervisor? And I always remind them that this is part of the border, the border Britain culture, right? That these types of immigration policies are not just only the dispersal orders, but it is within the healthcare system asking about somebody's immigration system. It is Queen's asking our international students to constantly fill out these monitoring forms. It becomes normalized, and we have to remind ourselves that this is abnormal.
This is not normal. And aren't we living in, I mean, strange times whereby we're trying to grapple with this along with managing the crisis in Ukraine, okay, which has produced more refugees than the Second World War. Horrendous atrocity. And I mean, you know, I don't think any of us will get our heads around what is happening there. But the outpour of support from the public, let's talk about UK and Ireland here, we're here, but across Europe and across the world essentially, has been notable. I've never seen the like of it before. We've people calling here every day, offering their homes. It's fantastic. Absolutely great to see that generosity of spirit there. And, you know, I might not necessarily agree with these sponsorship schemes and all the rest for other reasons, but it's good, you know, to capture that spirit that exists. However, that generosity of spirit and that outpouring of support is existing for one group of people who are refugees, and that's a fact. However, as we're aware, and you're very aware, we've been dealing with asylum seekers and refugees from crisis after crisis, Syria, Afghanistan, and Yemen. People don't even get a look in. So it's hard to navigate this whole, I don't know what to call it. I don't know how to describe what's happening. And I'm happy in one way to see maybe, you know, this focus on refugees. But the difficulty there is that the public are almost left to deal with this and to come up with their own kind of narrative and construct of what is a refugee. Well, it's people with a Ukrainian passport. Now, not even people who are from other communities living within Ukraine, which is one massive issue that we have to deal with. So there's a lot happening at once, but I fear that it's a really strong example of racism at work from Europe, but outside of Europe too. How do we grapple with this or can we? What can we do?
I think you're so right. And I think also what it does, is that it creates a hierarchy of victimhood or asylum and refugee seekers. So at the apex, we have Ukrainian refugees. And as you say, we have examples where we have Syrians, Afghanistan, etc., Yemen. So we start to create this hierarchy. And anyone who should understand, even like at a basic level, refugee and asylum law and the history of that and what it's about, there should not be a hierarchy in the way that we treat people fleeing for their lives, fleeing from persecution, violence, war, conflict, etc., etc. The whole list of things. So number one, our job is to point that out, that this hierarchy is false, right? That we can't accept it. We can't accept it. As much as the state, and, again, you're absolutely right, the kind of racial dynamics of European politics, as we just saw in France, we have to challenge that vocally and at every opportunity, right? So people will say to me, well, are you against the Ukrainian refugees? No, I'm not. No. I absolutely want people who are fleeing from a conflict to find sanctuary and safety and do that as soon as possible. But I am deeply concerned when we disperse people on the one hand, move them to Rwanda on another, and then at the same time present ourselves as, refugee friendly. Refugee friendly is has to mean something, or it doesn't mean anything. And I think for all of us and those of us listening, it's our job to continually fight that narrative that the state is pushing forward, because that's what they're doing. And we discussed this earlier. Yeah. It's a false narrative. It's there's nothing like a good divide and conquer. It's an old school tactic, but that's what they're doing. So some people are worthy and some are not.
And I think it comes back to the discussions that we were having at the start, that once we do something that's progressive, or something that's put through that's progressive, we need to then have some sense of self-reflection to whether it helps out a wide range of people and not just the one that it was aimed for. It needs to have a wide range of people. So yes, this scheme that's brought in may not be perfect, but it's definitely easier than the current asylum scheme.
Well, that's broken to hell.
So if it's that easy to bring in for Ukrainians, we need to have that self-reflection to whether it could be widespread for everyone.
I think I'm so negative about the whole thing, and I fear that this is just a tactic, an absolute a way to kind of dump this on the public, and that the public, as you said, this refugee friendly, and it's great, fantastic to have, but I think it's so dangerous in that it's creating xenophobia, racism within our own societies, but we're not going to be aware of it because we've done so much, to open our doors. We've assistance centres, all of this is great, but is that then, do you kind of wash your hands and kind of move on, and that's it, that's what we've done our duty, and that's it? How do we make sure that it remains part of our lives now? This has to continue. We have to be aware of the people who've been here for 10 years.
Yes.
They're just still just, imagine how they feel. God, I just keep, and people who have been, the Afghan refugee programs that are in place, by the way, people are still waiting in Kabul to get here 2 years later, and they're still getting, sorry, we'll be back to you some point. There's no response there. So it's a very dangerous, I don't know, it's a very difficult time, and I think, yes, we will need to reflect on it, but I feel like, I don't know, the messaging has just been so mixed here. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But yes, there's so much food for thought there. But just, I guess we'll finish up on the question that we ask all of our guests around activism, and the title of our podcast is Activist Lawyer. So what does that mean to you in terms of your work? Would you encourage people to become activists if they believe in challenging something, or do you think the law can be used as an effective tool for change?
That's wow. What activism means to me. Gosh, I think it's It's a hard question because I can't answer it without feeling like an emotional reaction.
Mm-hmm.
So activism for me, on the one hand, started off being around survival. So whether it's, you know, sexual violence, whether it's domestic violence, I saw activism as a tool to just survive those situations, and to help people to maneuver out of dangerous situations. And that was localized, personalized, and communal and familial. And that was a form of activism. And that's where I was molded to understand activism. Not in university, but in homes and families closest to me. And so that kind of activism was rooted within community. It relied on community to give sanctuary to a woman who was fleeing from an abusive partner. It relied on community to heal the wounds of somebody who came to your door battered and bruised, and you could just help, you know, bandage her or offer her pain medication or a bed for the night. I didn't know it then, but that was activism, as demonstrated by, you know, people around me as a young child growing up. And then you kind of grow up and you start to see these bigger and bigger injustices, and you're mad, and you're kind of thinking, what do I do about that? So you start to look to, and it's one of the reasons why I went into law, but you start to look at the like justice frameworks. So the law, as you say, the like justice system. And I went in with hopes and aspirations, and I was disappointed. I was disappointed when I saw, I saw people who treated me differently, other black people differently, who, when you enter a courtroom as a young, like a student who's doing a mini pupillage, and people are sort of wondering like, oh, are you with that barrister? And you start to see these little things in the justice system. And then you learn about the inherent like racial divisions within the justice system, the difficulties of rape survivors accessing justice, let alone getting justice in terms of a conviction that they may want to see at the end of the process. You start to see the chinks. And I always say to my students, it was not so much as seeing the chinks, but the reality of the work that needed to be done. And so activism to me is a commitment to that work, whatever that work is. So whether it's in environmental law, whether it's in housing, whether it's in immigration, it's a commitment to that work. So the question is, what's the work? And it will be different for each one of us. I hope that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense.
Perfect sense.
Dr. Yassin Brunger, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And we look forward to having you back soon to
Thank
catch
you.
up on all of your work. Thank
I'm all
you
fired
so
up
much.
now.
Oh, me too. Thank you. And thank you
so
to
much.
Thank you to everyone for listening.